From Evoke Media, I'm Sabrina Mirage Naeem. With me is Cassia Binkowski, and this is Breaking Glass, a series of conversations with women around the world who are shattering glass ceilings and challenging social norms. They are audacious, gutsy, and their stories are echoed across borders and generations in a rallying cry that is changing the narrative for women everywhere. Today's guest looks a little different than our usual interviewees. We're speaking with Jeffrey Tobias Halter, an expert in corporate gender equity. Jeffrey started his career in HR and sales, but pivoted when he realized that if he wasn't advocating for women's issues at work, then he wasn't advocating for the world that his daughter would inherit. Since then, Jeffrey has built Why Women, a consulting firm with deep expertise on engaging men to advance women in corporate America.
Sabrina, I'm really excited for our listeners to hear Jeffrey reflect on the inequity of his success. We challenge him with really hard questions about how his white male privilege has opened doors at huge corporations. And he's sharing how he's leveraging that position to invite men into the conversation about how they can be both allies and advocates for women.
And we're dissecting what that means, the difference between being an ally and an advocate, and how critical it is to normalize men's engagement on gender equity in the workplace. There's something to learn whether you're an employee or an employer, and regardless of what gender you identify with. Take a listen. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us from Atlanta today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. We're really excited to have this conversation with you. And frankly, we will acknowledge at this point that you look a little different than most of the guests that we have on this show. Namely, you have a different chromosome, but nonetheless, your experience in the field of gender equity in the workplace is, something that we are really excited to talk about. And you are certainly one of the people that we had on the list to engage with the subject. It's very timely. It is something that we care about deeply. So we're excited to chat with you about it. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, awesome. My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So let's just dive right in. We want to understand a little bit more about your background. You came up in corporate America, having spent the better part of your career working for the Coca-Cola Company, consulting for the likes of Bristol Myers Squibb, Deloitte, Citigroup, GE, Johnson & Johnson, Moet Hennessy, and more. And your early career was in sales and HR, but you now work in diversity, equity, and inclusivity, specifically as it relates to gender equity. What was the tipping point for you? When did you decide to shift your focus?
Yeah, I would love to say it was very intentional. I spent the first 20 years of my career in sales management, P&L responsibility, 2 years with Procter & Gamble, 18 years with Coca-Cola. And then in 2000, Coca-Cola actually had a $200 million discrimination lawsuit, something no company should ever go through. And at the time, I was liaison into the training function. I was actually a certified sales trainer. And they came to me and said, you're going to go lead the diversity education initiative as part of the consent decree. And I looked at them and said, I'm a straight white guy. I had no idea why I was getting this job. I didn't have a lot of say in it at the time. And so if you've ever seen this episode of The Office with the really awful diversity training, that was my program. And I would sit as a hostage in my own program every day, and we had to train 4,000 people. But something happened. I would sit in class and I would hear stories from my friends of racism and sexism and homophobia. And I had what they call a white male epiphany, where you realize what white male privilege is and the world revolves around me. I'm always the majority in the room. My voice is usually heard. And so I didn't choose to be an advocate at that point, but I chose to get curious. And so I would go out and talk to women and my friends who are people of color and just ask them what's going on that I don't experience or don't know. And this would lead to a whole series of things. I would end up becoming the first male member of the Koch Women's Forum. I would later be first chair of a number of planning events, chief of staff of the Diversity Advisory Council. And then my last role was actually the director of diversity strategy. And so for 3 years now, we were post lawsuit. Coca-Cola was winning awards for their diversity initiatives. And I got to go out and benchmark. And I got to benchmark with best in class companies around what they were doing. And it just dawned on me two things. One is that we don't spend enough time engaging white men in this conversation. And when you think about the fact that 80% of leadership in most companies is still men, you will never drive long-term systemic change without us. And then I saw another trend, and that is, having done this kind of work and being based in the South, when you mention diversity and inclusion, in the South, it's automatically race. But in the Northeast, it's women. And on the West Coast, it's a much broader expansion. And so it just dawned on me again to use gender as the gateway to diversity and inclusion. Because if we can't talk about men and women being different, then how are we going to talk about deeper dimensions of diversity? And so I was contemplating launching this consulting company around strategy. And I kept going to conferences, and I'd run into 5 or 6 men at these 800-person women's conferences. And I'd look at them and I'm like, dude, what are you doing here? And they're like, we want to help, but we don't know what to do. And that was really the tipping point where I said, oh my God, there are actually a lot of men who want to help at all levels of the organization, and they don't know what to do. And so I launched Why Women about 10 years ago. Pre-COVID, I was on the road 30 weeks a year doing this work with best-in-class companies. And it's really twofold. One's around strategy, getting the strategy and measures and metrics and programming right. And then the second part is training men of all levels to be advocates. So long answer to your question, but that's it.
No, but the curiosity that you're reflecting on, the humility that you had to go, to be able to ask, what don't I know? What am I missing? What don't I see? Is unfortunately all too rare. How were you perceived when you made that pivot? I mean, let's talk about that elephant in the room. You are the white male. You're working in gender equity now. What has the reception been?
Yeah, that's funny. Initially, I will say the bigger concern is by women. When I go into companies, it's like, why do we need a man? And then when they find out my background and what I do, I'm usually welcomed with open arms. They see me as an ally. It's like, well, you're saying the same thing that we've been saying to men. And the problem is their bias, the senior table that's still 80% men, hears it differently from me than they do from their own women in the organization. And quite frankly, I can frame it up a little different. I can call them on their crap in a manner that's a little different. So there's apprehension there. And then, I think a lot of the other apprehension, and this is what men deal with a lot of, is the fear of sticking out, the fear of going and being an advocate. And I actually received more group from my old sales management guys who, because I went to HR and I kind of, went to a staff role instead of staying in line. And the way to overcome fear that I've found in doing this work is you have to have a personal connection. I'm not saying you have to have. Most men that I have found have a personal connection. And for me, I never made the connection that if I wasn't part of the solution, I'm part of the problem. And if I'm not advocating for women, I'm betraying the women in my life, my spouse, my daughter, the women in my workplace. And so, quite frankly, when men kind of look at me sideways and say, why are you doing this work? I basically look at them and say, well, it's not for me, it's for your daughter, or it's for your spouse. And that immediately shifts the tone. You've got to make this personal. Sadly, you've got to make it personal. Men are not going to do this because it's the right thing to do. We've talked about the business case for 30 years. The numbers are overwhelming of what happens when you add women to the mix, and it's still not enough.